Welcome to the Franchise Secrets Podcast with your host, Eric Van Horn, and today's guest is Ron Feldman. Ron got his start in franchising early on at the Goddard School, and from there he went to FranData and got involved in the lending side of things, and today he's very involved with the IFA, doing things with the emerging brand sector there, so I want to dive into that, but also he is part of Apple Pie Capital. And this is probably the best way that I describe it is it's non-traditional lending for franchisees. And I've been a customer in the past out of necessity and had a great relationship with them. So we'll get into some of the things that Apple Pie Capital does differently than anybody else that I know of in the industry. At least they were the pioneers of it in my humble opinion. But Ron, welcome to the show, and why don't you take us back to the beginning?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Eric. I really appreciate it. Back to the beginning in franchising was in the early 90s. My wife, who was an educator, went and interviewed to be the director of a thing called the Goddard School. I found out quickly that that was a franchise, and found out that the parent company for the Goddard School was the same parent company that started Amco and Mako, two national brands. So I quickly knew that they understood franchising, which is different than understanding running corporate units. And we changed our path from being an employee to being a franchise owner. I will tell you that it took us 3 years from the time we signed our franchise agreement to the time we finally opened our doors. Almost to the day. Real estate is a challenge.
A long, unexpected wait, right?
We had 4 locations and 3 didn't pan out and 1 did, but each one of them required zoning because this was a freestanding building on an 1.5 acres with a playground, and everybody wants a child care center, but they never want them in their neighborhood. So we learned quickly how to develop real estate. We finally were able to open, and we operated it for 10 years. I got very close with Tony Martino, who was the founder of all 3 of those companies. And I was in the burglar alarm business at that point, doing mergers and acquisitions and doing a roll-up. And I was a deal guy and a finance guy. And one day, Tony and I were having a conversation. He said, "Can you help me finance Makos?" And I was like, "Well, let's figure it out." And one thing led to another. And I joined up with a guy named Bernie Siegel, who was one of the icons in franchising. At one point, he was Dunkin' Donuts' largest franchisee with 4 or 5 units in the 70s. And we got together and we launched a franchise finance company that, as of now, the remnants of that are part of Apple Pie. And operated that for a while. While I was doing that, I decided to invest in a couple of other franchises. One didn't go so well and one went pretty well. I've been a franchisee 3 times. And when I exited my lending business back in 2014, I went over to FranData. And FranData is the preeminent market research firm in all of franchising, dedicated only to franchising. In fact, today the Forbes top 30 and bottom 30 came out, and FranData does the research for that. So brands that are in the top 30 got very happy, and brands that are in the bottom 30 are probably not so happy. Learned a lot about the business model there.
What did you do
about how to win? I was Chief Development Officer was my title. I worked on the lending side. We created a thing called a fund score, F-U-N-D, not fun, but fund score, which for all intents and purposes is like a credit score for a brand. So a bank could look at a brand and see based on that score what their risk might be to make a loan to that brand. And that score is now widely used by banks all over the country. So we launched that product and started selling it to banks. I also got very involved in the private equity side in doing outsourced due diligence for PE firms that were buying franchisors mostly, and needed to get access to data to benchmark what they were buying against what was in the same sector, what the green space that was available to develop the brand, et cetera. So And the third thing I did there was work with suppliers to franchising to figure out what brands would fit their products best. So those are the three things that I specialized in while I was there. One of the people that was one of my clients there was someone named Denise Thomas, who had this idea of starting a company called Apple Pie Capital. And I was a consultant and advisor to Denise when the company started. And one thing led to another, and a couple of years later, once Apple Pie was firmly entrenched and had a really good baseline with a bank as an equity holder, I jumped ship, and now I'm running the development efforts here at Apple Pie.
How long has Apple Pie been lending?
Since 2015. First loan was made in 2015, and I will tell you that today in 2019, we're probably in the top 10 or 15 of franchised lending, outside of the folks that do the 2,000 unit Arby's franchisees. But the Main Street franchise lending, we're definitely in the top 10 or 15
So
in terms of lenders.
So explain to the audience, like it's not a traditional bank loan that they're getting, or the fund's not coming from a traditional bank necessarily. So explain to the audience, like what Apple Pie does with their core program.
Sure. So Apple Pie is a platform. That's the easiest way to describe it. We have a network of 35 banking partners that we have, and we have our own captive capital, which we call the core loan. That captive capital is sourced from either banks or non-banks, some debt funds, all kinds of different sources. But in that product, Apple Pie Capital controls the originations, the underwriting, the closing, and the servicing of the loans, and the workouts, although we've had very few. So you're dealing with us from start to finish. The cool thing about the way the company has morphed, probably since you were a customer, Eric, is we now also, with one application, one digital online application, can score your application to have the best fit capital meet it internally, and provide you with the options that you qualify for, so that you can decide based on more than what the lowest rate is, because people get hung up on the lowest interest rate. But if you want to open 5 in 3 years, the lowest interest rate's not what's important. It's who's going to lend you the money for those 5, right?
No, that's exactly it. Because I mean, and you hear that more and more people are buying larger development areas these days. You know, as I help people buy franchises and find good brands, they are signing 3-unit deals and 6-unit deals, and they say, well, how am I going to open these things up? And you know, they talk to the SBA, and SBA is going to be like, we're going to do these things one at a time, maybe 2 at one time.
There's actually rules. You know, there's actually rules. The SBA rule is if you get approved to do 2, they both have to fund within 12 months.
Yep.
So what happens if you have a little construction or permitting delay, which you have all the time in California and New York and a bunch of other states, and it's 12 months and 1 day, your approval's gone, and it can't be given back to you. I mean, you need to know the rules. More important than you don't need to know the rules, you need to know someone who knows the rules. And trust them to be your advisor. And that's kind of our approach when we're doing lending to franchisees. Our first question is, so Eric, how do you want to open your first, whatever unit you're opening? Our first question is, well, what did you sign up for? What are your goals? Tell us about what you have financially. Tell us about what you have operationally. And we are going to put a plan together with you to get you to your goals. We've taken folks and brands like Jimmy John's from unit 1 to unit 30. And might have used 10 different banks along the way, and our own money. But we're agnostic to what product someone takes. We want them to achieve their goals, and that's kind of what our core value is. That we want franchisees to grow smartly.
Yeah, and you have to grow smartly. I'm talking to a business partner in one of mine, and we got a local bank to finance it. And they've said that they would finance the second one as well, but he's already worried about the third one. And I've been around enough. I'm not worried about it because, you know, we'll find something. But for the average first time franchisee in a good brand, like they don't know where loan for number three is going to come from. And that's a very uneasy feeling for a lot of these people, even though a lot of times it does, if they do well, banks do want to loan to them if they, have the right financials and the capital and things. But that's why I love the core program. And so my story is we had Solo Salon Studios. We, at that time, they were approved by the SBA. And this is the thing, that there's so many unknowns out there. Even though you know the rules, you know how things are going to happen, there are unknowns, things that will happen. And this is just business. So we were approved for 2 SBA loans within 12 months, and we actually opened them up within 12 months of each other. And then we were ready for, to start working on number 3. And the SBA said, we are no longer approving salon suites to be on the SBA approved, list. And for a number of different reasons, one in particular, and that has to do with basically it's too passive for them. And it, all of a sudden, what we thought we had as a lending partner, they were all gone. And that's when we came knocking on Apple Pie's door and said, hey, will you guys take us? And, what I want to go into now is, like, if we were a part of a new startup in the salon suite industry, and no name, you would have said, go pound sand. We are not interested. But because we were part of a brand that, I don't know, we were one of the first or in that initial group, but Solo was at the size, I guess, that was approved by Apple Pie. So what do you guys look for in brands?
So we look for, in our core product, 10 years of corporate operating history, or 25 open franchise units for more than 3 years. That's kind of our hard cut. We don't want to be on the sharp edge of the knife, because there's a lot of franchise brands that start and never get to 25, or they get to 25 and then they stay at 25. Mm-hmm. And we're not getting a guarantee from Uncle Sam. One of the unique things about the core product is the only collateral we take is the unit and a personal guarantee of the shareholders. So unlike an SBA loan where you're putting up your house and your stocks and bonds and your children, we don't take all of that. We just take a personal guarantee. So we need to have a real sense of the brand's ability to scale, not just in its home markets, but in secondary and tertiary markets, in order for us to get comfortable with the brand. So our model is really brand centric. We work with brands who send franchisees to us, or we create a program with captive capital for a brand where we allocate a certain amount of money to that brand. We just did one with Amazing Lash Studios, who already has 300 or 400 units, but we just allocated, I think, $20 million for their franchisees to grow, and we have predetermined with the brand who qualifies. So it's not a question of whether. So you're going to qualify, and we're comfortable with the brand. And one of the things you said about, well, the SBA is always looking for you to look. They look in the rear view mirror at your performance as to whether or not they're going to lend money to you. Well, there's a lot of franchise brands out there today that are slow ramp. Goddard School is one. Mm-hmm. My fixed costs on day one for an 8,000 square foot building were the same as they were at the end of 6 months when it was full. But I had to make it those 6 months, and I might have wanted to go to unit 2 while I was doing that. So by taking such a deep dive at the brand level, we know whether you're hitting the right metric after 60 days, 90 days. So we're more willing to lend money faster to you as a franchisee and one of our brand partners than any other lender will. I can say that unequivocally, unless you're putting up, collateral that's different. I'm talking about putting up the business in a personal guarantee. So, and that's why I'm so passionate with the emerging brands. I don't want brands to make mistakes.
Yeah, because what's your definition of an emerging brand, roughly?
Well, there's no real definition, right? Everyone has their own.
More earlier than 20, less than 25.
So I think there's startup brands, and that's less than 25. And I think emerging goes to 100. And the reason I say 100 is when I was at Frandata, we did a study. And generally, when a brand hits 100 units, they don't rely on initial franchise fees to cover their overhead. their royalties cover all of their overhead. So one of the real questions, your folks who are listening, if they're getting into unit 3, I can tell you whatever that franchise fee is making somebody's paycheck good as a rule at the franchisor level. And they are probably less selective early, which is the complete polar opposite of what they should be doing long term. So you really have to be careful when you're investing in what I call a startup franchisor. Once they get to royalty self-sufficiency is the industry term, then you kind of graduate and you're not an emerging brand anymore.
And that's typically about 100 units. Is that typically like when private equity comes in and starts to look at these franchisors and they have 100 open?
They're courting them from the beginning because franchisors are great investments for private equity. So they're following them. They're not investing in them at that point, but they're following them. We got involved very early with Orange Theory Fitness years ago at Apple Pie, and our core product helped them scale in a big way. But they did some really smart things, Dave and Ellen, the founders, by bringing work in as a minority partner early, Work Capital I'm talking about, who owns half the franchise companies out there, who showed them both what to do and what not to do to scale. So I see a lot of franchisors that get caught up, and I've coined my own term, I call it founder syndrome, where they need to bring in professional management because they've never run a business that big. They started with 3 restaurants or whatever it is, and now there's 40 or 50 of them, and they need professional management, and very few can carry it like a guy like Peter Cancro at Jersey Mike's, who is the founder and still the sole owner of Jersey Mike's 1,500 restaurants later. That doesn't happen very often.
No, and like you said, I mean, they want to stick around longer than they should. So is that one of the things as you look at brands is the leadership and who they are today and kind of the plan as they scale?
We target based on leadership. We underwrite also, it's very different having, and I'll use food because food's easy to understand. Running a restaurant and running a restaurant chain versus managing franchisees who are running your restaurants are 2 completely different skill sets. You can't fire your franchisees like you can fire a store manager. You can, but it gets very expensive. So you need to have franchising expertise on the leadership tree in your FDD as much as you need to understand what your operating business model is. And that's another thing I've seen in my studies of emerging brands, that founders don't bring in folks with franchising experience. They bring in folks with operating experience, and it's a completely different skill set. Not that one's better than the other, they're just different.
Well, I would think franchising experience is better. And I guess maybe it's just the brands that I've been around, but those that don't bring in franchise experience they don't understand the relationship with the franchisor or franchisee as much. So is that what you're getting at with the franchise experience? They understand that relationship and understand the roles better, and they're able to get the communication out to the field?
Absolutely. And there's, right now there's this whole, I don't know if you follow the IFA, government relations team, but this whole joint employer issue that's out there can blow up the franchising model. If we let the regulators do what they want to do. Control over employees is really the single issue that's at hand. And people who are operations based want to control the employees more than people that are franchising based who want their franchisees to control their employees. Franchisee's employee is not the franchisor's employee, and it has to stay that way.
Tell me about the emerging brand sector in the IFA and your role within that.
Sure. So when Shelley Sun was the chair of the IFA, she asked me, and I find it very hard to say no to her, to chair this emerging franchisor task force. So every year at the convention, we've done it 3 or 4 years now, we run a boot camp that is now before the convention, that basically brings last year 400 folks into one room, 8 to a table with a franchise C-suite executive at the table. Everyone brings three to 5 things that keep them up at night. And there's a discussion about how to deal with that in a group setting. We also have partnered with the Springboard Emerging Brand Conference that's run by Lane Fisher and Brad Fishman. So we do a similar thing there. We have a formal mentoring program being launched as well. And we've now dovetailed all of that in with the IFA Emerging Franchisor Conference. So you've got 3 or 4 events each year that emerging brands can go. And the thing that I stress is you're going to learn what not to do. Mm-hmm. It's more important to learn what not to do than it is to learn what to do.
It's so true. I was on a podcast earlier today and we were talking just about that. It's being okay with failure. And you learn from failure and making micro failures, but it's even better to learn from other people's failures. And they've made it. I mean, if you're in a group of people around, Brad Fishman and Lane, and I mean, it's like they've seen it all.
Yep. And that's kind of why when I joined Apple Pie, and Randy Jones, who from Funding Solutions, so Apple Pie acquired Funding Solutions, which was run by Randy and his now passed father, Jerry, who partnered up just 11 years ago with a couple of brands. One was Jimmy John's and the other was Camp Bow Wow. And the third was actually Little Caesars. And created this similar business model to what Apple Pie is. And Randy and I, it's funny, we were frenemies for like 15 years. We were friendly competitors. And now we're on the same team and we keep looking at each other and saying, dang, geez, why didn't we do this 15 years ago? Because we literally finish each other's sentences. So it's understanding what best practices are and understanding what worst practices are equally important. And if you're going to build a sandwich chain, you'd much rather build a Jimmy John's than a Quiznos. And they have the same product.
Yeah.
Right?
Here's a question. I think it's on my mind at least. Like, so franchisors publish FDDs and they have an item 19 in, and they can publish, financial performance in there. When you look at the item 19, like, what's your honest thought on that? Do you think like these are numbers that are getting spun, or is this a benchmark that you kind of look at, but you're wary of, or you're like, this is gospel?
Not the latter. Except for one. There's one FDD and one item 19 that is the gold standard for all others, and that is the Goddard School item 19. Every franchise school P&L is in it.
Wow.
All 475 of them. But item 19, there's no consistency to them. So unless you know how to read item 19s, you get caught up in the charts. And I read item 19s the same way that I read financial statements. I look at the footnotes first, because that's where everything is buried. And then I look at the charts to understand what the footnotes told me. So if they're saying, the top quintile did this, well, that means there's 4 quintiles that didn't do that. And what did the bottom do? And somewhere in the middle is probably where an average person is going to be. But more important as a lender, which is the hat that I wear, how fast does the business ramp? Mm-hmm. Is it a business that, like a restaurant, the first month in business is the best month you ever have because you spent $20,000 on a grand opening, versus, a Massage Envy or Hand and Stone, where you have 0 members when you start and you still have all your fixed costs. So you have to understand more than what's in the item 19. As franchisors that just put sales in item 19s, which is still the majority, you might as well not put one in, as far as I'm concerned. And I always get heat for that when I speak. But gross sales, I mean, when you have 3 different footprints of a restaurant, you have an inline, you have a drive-through, and you have a standalone. Mm-hmm. And then you just put one item 19 in and the average gross sales are $1 million. Well, I want to open a kiosk. You know, what are those? Unless it's at granular, then you're not getting the whole truth.
So
I can tell you when we bought our Goddard, we were early, but we went and visited physically in 15 schools and interviewed the owners and found out what they were doing. And validation in franchise development is the most important thing.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I'd like to spend some time on validation. You can talk from the lender, put your lender hat on, put your person that's looking at buying a franchise hat on, because that's absolutely critical. I mean, and that's where a lot of people have a hard time. They don't know how to validate correctly, and they put more weight onto certain things than they should, and less weight onto others. So, like, just walk us through how you validate as a lender and as a franchisee, prospective franchisee. Sure.
So it's interesting. I go back to Tony Martino again. By the way, he never finished high school, just FYI.
Wow.
and he launched 3 brands, took them national, and died, you know, a very, very wealthy individual.
He was he was a mentor of yours, right?
So he started Amco, Mako, and Goddard. He actually started another one called Amicar, and he was involved in Sparks too. He was involved in 5 brands. And he was the owner of the Goddard franchisor when we got involved. And he kind of was my mentor in learning franchising. And we got very close until he passed away about 11, 12 years ago. And then the company was sold after he passed away to Driven Brands. Actually, Driven Brands went to Harvest Partners, and then it went to Driven Brands. So it was two owners ago. He had a line that I thought was the best line of anyone I've ever learned. And it went like this. This is the high school guy. Franchising is simple as long as franchisees make money. And if every franchisor used that sentence in every business decision that they make about changing something, and that what the outcome had to be, yes, they make money, then the lawyers would never have any money because there'd never be litigation. So Lane doesn't like that line so much. No, I'm just kidding. So when I look at validation from a lending standpoint, we get data. You know, we sign an NDA with the brand, and we get data that a franchisee can't get because we don't get the FTC rule in our favor. So we mine data. We also validate with franchisees. You know, when we're onboarding a brand, we do all the same deal. We do the social media diligence. We do all kinds of stuff. We use the fund report as a litmus test. I went from a Frandata CDO to a Frandata customer, very happy Frandata customer, by the way. And we have a whole process for which we use to underwrite brands. And the simple premise is if units stay open, they generally pay their loans back. To break it down to a very simple metric. So we look at when I pick up an FDD, item 20 is the first thing I look at, which is the chart of openings and closings. Mm-hmm. And if the closings are if it's a young brand, and I'll go back to this emerging brand thing, if you have less than 25 units open, you can't let any unit close if you want to have a future. You got to buy it back, fix it, refranchise it, operate it as a corporate unit. But people get involved in franchising and they just have enough money to create an FDD. They're not well capitalized enough to handle any bumps along the road. Shelley's book, I don't know if you've ever read it, Shelley Sun's book, Grow Smart, Risk Less. Her book, if you're an emerging franchisor, is a must read. I would have your listeners put that on their reading list. It's been out 4 or 5 years. But it really explains how franchising is a distribution model. That's really what it is. And from a franchisee validation perspective, there is nothing like talking to franchisees and not the ones that they put on the conference call with you. And that's common sense, right? Common sense is they're all listed in the back of the FDD. And I will tell you one other thing, little tidbit. We were franchisees in the Goddard system for 9.5 years. Well, we were franchisees for longer than that because it took us 3 years to open. So 12 years. In the 12 years, I got a total of a dozen validation calls, maybe one a year. In the year we were in the SDD as someone who exited the system, because you go in there 1 year, these are the franchisees that exited, I got a dozen calls that year. Why? And these are the questions. Why did you leave? Was it a good experience for you? Would you do it again? So for anyone who's listening who's a prospective franchisee, those are the, did you make money? Obviously was in every one of them, but that is very important in terms of validation.
This is the real stuff. I mean, this is the stuff that you don't hear most places. You don't hear it from people that are trying to sell franchises. I mean, this is.
I have no filter. Everyone who knows me knows I have no filter. I speak the truth from the street. That's my mantra.
And we talked about that before we came on. I said, my role in this podcast is to get real information out that it's called franchise secrets. It's stuff that people just don't talk about. There's no real secret about it, but it's stuff that people just don't openly talk about. There's not a place for them to get this kind of information on how to validate. And,
absolutely.
And it's true. And so to play devil's advocate with that, you don't want to just listen to all the top franchisees that are on all the calls that are being paraded around. You don't want to put, weight it towards that. How much do you weight towards the people that are negative, that had a bad experience? Like, how do you deal with that?
Well, I'm pretty direct. So I would call my franchise development person and say, hey, I spoke with Eric and he really is a pretty unhappy franchisee. Can you tell me why he's unhappy? And see how they answer. If the first question is, well, that's different than, he doesn't follow the system. He's below our brand standard. If the answers are that we have brand standards and he's trying to do it his own way, that's a very different answer than, he's fat and happy, something like that. So the other conundrum I see franchisors getting into is selling 5 and 10 packs before they have any operating history with anyone. Because if you hate each other after the first unit, it's hard to get a divorce, franchisee and franchisor, and you're stuck with each other. So Jimmy John's in the early days would sell you 1 unit. They wouldn't let you to lock up territory. After you operated it for a year, then they'd sell you 5 or 10 more. And that's a best practice. Not everybody can afford to do that. Yeah. They did it.
What's their story? How did they, everybody knows about Jimmy John's and they go in, what's interesting about them too, and some of these sub shops, they're able to go into small markets so they can expand quite rapidly. Right. But what is it about Jimmy John's that makes them so great?
Well, it's interesting. They're going through a cycle right now. Jimmy John's before the last 3 years happened was the only place you could get freaky fast delivery. And now that's not true. So they're in the process of they don't have to, and they're wildly successful, but they have to kind of pivot a little bit. And if you've seen their commercials now with this, I don't know if you see, they're hilarious, but the guy riding his bike and he falls off. He rides into a glass wall and he falls off his bike because he's outside the delivery area. And we want the food to be freaky fresh for you. They've changed their messaging in a very positive way, and it's shown in the numbers. But they put a quality product out at a reasonable price, and they got it to you very quickly. That's a different value proposition than Jersey Mike's is giving you. They're a sub above. They're all about quality and not at the best price. They're a couple bucks more. And then, if you go to the third largest, you got Subway, and, Subway's going through a real tough time right now. So, they were all about price more than anything else, over anything else. But, so everyone has their own value prop. Jersey Mike's is growing. They're going to add almost 200 units this year. wildly successful, great food, partnered up with the delivery services so they can deliver as well. So having that virtual delivery in the food space has become an equalizer for some brands.
Let's dive into the fitness space. I heard Orange Theory, Anytime Fitness, any other fitness brands that you guys work with?
We work with Crunch Fitness as well, and there's a few others. We like the fitness space. It's getting very crowded. There's a fitness brand born probably every week, especially in what's called the new subsector boutique fitness, and that would be the cycle bars and the stretch labs and all of those smaller brands. There's going to be winners and losers. I look at it like the Better Burger a few years ago, or the frozen yogurt before that. There's going to be survivors. If you're a prospective franchisee, you want to be with the survivor. You've got to do a little more diligence, or you got to decide, I'm a risk taker and I'll take a shot at the person who's knocking off Orange Theory. Because there's 3 or 4 that are doing that now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a tough one. I mean, Orange Theory they were first to market, and they're not letting their foot off the gas. I mean, they are still going, innovating. From what I understand, I have friends who are franchisees with them, business partners of mine now in other brands that are franchisees with Orange Theory, and they love Orange Theory.
Yeah. Well, we see a lot of people so one of the other cool things about our core product that I didn't mention is let's say you had a bunch of solas and you wanted to open Orange Theories, a traditional lender is going to make you put up your solas in order to open the Orange Theory. Mm-hmm. They're not going to let you separate one brand from another. And if you have multi-brand, multi-unit franchisees, the core product only takes a lien on the unit that we're financing. So we see a lot of multi-branded folks come into our doors who want to borrow money for one of our brands who are in other brands. But let's just say there's 5 partners in the network of solas and only 3 of them want to open the Orange Theory. Well, then you can't use the solas.
Yep.
So we're seeing a ton of that where there's differentiation in who the partners are in each of the 2 entities, or someone in one partnership group also already owns a competing brand and can't go on the franchise agreement. We see that a lot as well. So there's a lot of nuance to multi-branding franchise, but in fitness, you're seeing a little roll up with exponential brands now. I don't know if you know who they are, but they bought Pure Bar. And
I'm a franchisee with a couple of their brands.
Are you? Okay. Well, cool. Well, we financed a lot of Pure Bar, and we're doing some Club Pilates now, and they have a couple of almost pure startup brands that they're launching as well. So we like the fitness space, but we know it's crowded, and we are selective. That's probably the banker's answer.
Like you were mentioning, it's boutique fitness, and that's a lot of what Expo is, and that's a lot of what. People come to me and they want to buy franchises, and I know these guys very well. I've done a bunch of business with them personally, and I have friends that are own a lot of those brands. And but what's interesting about them is their track record, right? And that's kind of reminds me of what we're talking about earlier with franchising experience and industry experience. And in a lot of their brands, they have both of those, and they definitely have the franchise experience at the corporate office, but they're super young. Some of these brands are like, like you said, they're in the infancy. They are startup brands, but they're with a company that has a lot of franchise experience. So how much more weight would you put on like that brand being a winner eventually versus, the one that doesn't have a lot of franchise experience behind them?
A lot. Especially because in exponential and focus brands on work and all, there's a shared service suite. So the G&A is shared amongst all the brands. Mm-hmm. And then they might each have a development team, and they each have their own brand people running each brand. So that G&A in an infancy stage is being covered by some of the other larger brands. That's quite honestly, when we started with Goddard, we were so early. They were housed inside of Maaco's offices. They had 4 offices inside the Maaco headquarters. But they were using the real estate department of Maaco, and they were using the advertising department of Maaco. So I was there. I mean, I was part of a shared service, multi-branded franchisor. And you're seeing a lot more of that. You just saw the Wellbiz brand bought Amazing Lash.
Yep.
So you're seeing that in private equity a lot, where there is a consolidation in a similar space where private equity is trying to lever their G&A costs by having a shared service model.
Yeah, and I just got off the phone with a franchisee with one of the Expo brands. He's somebody that I helped get into it. He's been a friend for a long time, and he's a multi-brand franchisee. But he's like, "Hey, Eric, I was talking to somebody that used to be with Club Pilates and helping people with sales. Now he's with this other brand because he got pulled off to help this other brand that's struggling with helping some of the not struggling, helping. They wanted his experience with Club Pilates to help this other brand help their new franchisees with the sales process, because he has the experience, and that's what you get when you are able to combine, brands like that and share resources.
Sure, you have a bench. It's always good to have a bench and have bench strength. Emerging brands. That's why I always say to emerging brands, the founders, if you can get smart money in, you should. Dumb money isn't just money, but if you can get somebody that's willing to invest some money and bring their years or decades of expertise to you, you should.
Yeah, I mean, I've done that myself. I mean, that's amazing when you can do that. And so, I mean, that's just kind of like, how do you do that? How would you do that as a franchisee? Is there any way that you can take advantage of that as a franchisee? Smart money or partnerships or mentoring? Like how can you do that as a franchisee?
Well, if you're a great operator, there's two ways to do it. You're either a great operator who needs money, or you're somebody who has money that needs an operator. And there's actually a third way, which is you're a great operator, but you're not a great developer. So they're all three different skills. I'll just give you 30 seconds on each. If you're a great developer, it means you know how to build stores. You know the real estate markets, the landlords, the contractors. That's a skill set that not every franchisee has. If you're a great operator, that's pretty much self-defining. You know how to manage units well. And if you're an investor, you might not want to have all the heartache of doing all that, but you're not going to roll your sleeves up and get involved. So what we've seen very successful is great operators being paired with investors where they borrowed their money out. We've actually done webinars on this where I have no dry powder left. I've got 5 units open, but they're killing it. And I want to open 10 more. And what we see there is other franchisees in those systems partnering up with them for growth in the same brand versus going out into the market to try to raise money.
Yep.
We see that a lot. If you're a great developer, well, first of all, maybe a brand like Sola or Phoenix or My Salons or any of those salon suite brands, that's a developer skill set.
Yep.
You don't have to be a great operator because you have no employees or very few employees.
Yeah.
And if you just have money, you're making bets. All you're doing is making bets on skills. So you're investing in people, and that's where when I counsel franchisees on running their books and their finances, it destroys me when their accountant says, well, you should be living your life in this checkbook because you don't want to pay any tax. And, you're running all this personal expense through the company books. And then they come to me to borrow money and they're break even. And they want to borrow money against their units. And I go, well, show me the money. And they go back to the movie, right? Show me the money.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have it. They have it, and then they start giving me these ad backs.
Yep.
So depending on what those ad backs are, that could be tax fraud. Or it might just be living life a little on the edge and gray. But when it's material, and I mentioned this at a brand conference in March, we did a workshop on capital access. And guy raises his hand. He says, well, I'm asking for a friend. The whole place, roars because he's asking for a friend. And he says, well, what if I have $80,000 in my P&L that was really personal stuff, but I ran it through the business? I said, well, we lend generally 3 to 3.5 times that $80,000. So that's $240,000 to $275,000 that you can't borrow from us now because you ran your business that way. I said, but the good news is it's March. You didn't file your return yet. Go fix it.
What are some of these things that are people that are like the non-legitimate business expense, the personal expenses that are being run through the business?
I could give you stories that we wouldn't believe. I had somebody run an addition through their house, $70,000 of a new kitchen, the whole thing on their house, and they ran it through a food business that was a leasehold drive-through. So they had $70,000 of construction costs in a non-remodel year.
Tax
people
fraud.
putting their kids school tuition through the business. Things like a car, cell phones. Things you're using for business anyway. Everyone understands that, but your kid's tuition is not that's not an add back. It's we've seen you wouldn't believe. I think you do a whole show on funny things we've seen. I saw a Lamborghini on one, a lease on a Lamborghini in a QSR P&L for a QSR, quick service restaurant. Yeah,
Not
and
Jimmy
it was
John's.
a $2,800.
That makes sense, but
yeah, you can drive fast. You wrap it, right?
yeah,
You can wrap your Lamborghini with it. It would look like the race car. They got a race car in
they're
NASCAR.
fast. They're super, super fast. So freaky
Yeah,
fast.
exactly.
This is interesting stuff. I mean, if people go back and listen to this, there's like nuggets spread throughout this podcast of, validation. That was a good conversation around validation. Anybody that's like researching a franchise should probably be listening to that and taking note. But just the pitfalls of lending and just the surprises that most people don't think about when they're wanting to scale. And you need to have the right advisors around you. Like you said, you don't need to know this stuff yourself, but you need to have the people around you that you trust to be able to give you the information that you need so you can make the right decisions as you scale your business. Any last bits of wisdom for the audience?
Sure. So you have a team. You have an attorney. You have an accountant. You have your own professional team. You should have a capital markets advisor on your team. Your accountant is not your CFO, usually. Your accountant might be really good at doing tax returns, but they've never run a business. Depends on who they are. Your lawyer is a really good lawyer, probably never ran a business. You need someone who understands the capital markets on your team. And obviously we'd like for it to be apple pie, but there's plenty of companies out there that do things similar to what we do, not as good as we do it, but to understand how to get you to where you want to be. You want to build an empire or you want to buy a job. Franchising is one of two things. You either want to buy a job or you want to have an empire. And if your goal is empire building, you need to have somebody on your team. If your goal is to open one unit and run it and do it, then it's a lot easier to figure out that gap. But you need to know how many units your money is going to get you to and how well you need to run your business to get you to that goal. And you need to know it from somebody who understands your brand, understands what the ramp time in your brand is, and understands the capital markets. And those are the things you need to understand. And you should get someone on your team who understands that. That would be the biggest nugget of all.
Dude, that's great advice. And where people that are empire builders, building multi-unit, multi-brand empires, they need to pull themselves out of the weeds and have really strong advisors, like you just said. And I know if I had that earlier on in my career, it would have saved me some heartache and some bad decisions and would have accelerated my growth. My growth would have accelerated in Sola if I had known some of the things that I know today about that business and the industry and the capital markets. And we would have made way more money on the sale as a result of that. And we didn't do too bad, by the way.
It's always good to have a liquidation event.
Yes. Well, thanks again for your time, and I might have you back on at some point. I just love the background, the expertise, and are you going to be at the Springboard conference?
Yeah, it's in Philly, and I live in Philly, so I'm usually around there. Sure.
Well, I get to buy you a drink. I think I'm going to make it this year, and I'll buy you a drink, and we'll have some fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great conference for emerging brands. You need to be there. That is more nuggets than you'll leave with a sack full of nuggets if you go there as an emerging franchisor.
Get to the Springboard conference in the fall. Get to the unconference put on by the same folks in Park City in the early spring,
March.
early spring,
Always March. Yeah.
March, and lots
The
of fun.
unconference is a lot of fun.
Oh, it's a ton of fun, lots of networking, and you're doing it in outside of the normal conference type setting. You're doing it on the slopes, you're doing it in activities, and it's fantastic. So quick plug for the unconference and Springboard. Thanks again, Ron.
My pleasure. Great talking to you.